Hello, everyone, and welcome to Asian states and their diasporas. My name is Scarlett Barnett. I work with the Asia Institute, and I'm joined by three wonderful speakers who have been published in the current edition of Melbourne Asia Review. I am joined by Robi Rado, who is a fellow at Melbourne Law School, Yan Tan, who is an associate professor at the University of Adelaide, and Andrew Rosser, who is a professor of Southeast Asian Studies and also Deputy Director of the Asia Institute here at the University of Melbourne. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're meeting. I'm currently sitting on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation, and Robi joins us from Boonwurrung country, which is also of the Kulin Nation. And Yan and Andrew are calling in from Ghana country. So I pay my respect to elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend this acknowledgement and respect to any First Nations people who might be joining us today via Zoom or Facebook or watching on the replay. Now, in the first part of the seminar, we'll be looking at three diaspora case studies, India, China, and Indonesia. And then we'll move into a panel discussion and Q&A to explore the topic further and also try to address any questions you may have. So if you're joining us through Zoom webinar, you can use the chat function to make comments as we go along. And if you have questions you'd like to direct to the speakers, you can use the Q&A function. So that's at the bottom of your screens. So let's dive in. I'd like to invite Robi to speak on our first case study and perhaps the largest diaspora, India. Over to you, Robi.
Thank you, Scarlett. And thank you to the Asia Institute for this invitation to participate in this webinar on such an important topic. United Nations data suggests that 18 million Indians live outside of India, making India the world's largest source of international migrants. The Indian government offers different statistics, suggesting that there are 32 million overseas Indians, as it calls them. They're spread far and wide. Large numbers are in the Persian Gulf region, around 3.4 million in the UAE, 2.6 million in Saudi Arabia, more than 1 million in Kuwait, and so on. Elsewhere, 4.5 million in the US, 3 million in Malaysia, quite some way down the list, 500,000 in Australia. Many, many other places. In 2001, the High-Level Committee on the Indian Diaspora opened its report with the words, quote, "The Indian diaspora spans the globe and stretches across all the oceans and continents. It is so widespread that the sun never sets on the Indian diaspora," unquote. I'll come back to that report because it marked an important shift in Indian government policy towards the diaspora. But there's a preliminary question first. What is a diaspora? It might seem obvious, something perhaps about migrants and their descendants. Yet after that, it gets more difficult, and scholars argue about what characteristics you need to have to be part of a diaspora. For example, is a desire to return to a homeland essential? Do you need a connection to a homeland at all? If you identify your homeland as Tamil Nadu, would that make you part of the Tamil diaspora or the Indian diaspora or both? How about if your ancestors left India in colonial times from land that's now part of Pakistan? In a webinar on Asian states and their diasporas, I think it's worth starting by noting that it's not always obvious who forms part of a diaspora and which diaspora they might be part of. As Rogers Brubaker has suggested, diaspora is a notion that's invoked, quote, "to make claims, to articulate projects, to formulate expectations, to mobilize energies, to appeal to loyalties," unquote. A notion that's often used in a manner that, quote, "does not so much describe the world as seek to remake it," unquote. So who counts as part of a diaspora depends on who's doing the talking and why. The report by the High-Level Committee on the Indian Diaspora talks about people who left India in very different eras and circumstances, sometimes before Indian independence. People with different loyalties to India, speaking different languages and living in different parts of the world, yet all described as forming one group, a group said to be Indian, a diaspora, and the one and only Indian diaspora. Just as with any description of any diaspora, this characterization wasn't self-evident. But the report used it anyway, and the report led to far-reaching changes in Indian diaspora policy. The Indian government is now keen to build a strong relationship with Indian migrants abroad. And one manifestation of this change in policy came with the establishment in 2004 of a new ministry to deal with these migrants called the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. So what kind of relationship is the Indian government trying to build with Indian migrants abroad? I suggest that it's a relationship that reflects the government's concern with India's development, and that, as a result, the Indian government is helping build a particular kind of relationship between migration and development in India. The Indian government is doing this in ways that aren't being widely debated, but I think that they should be, because they involve important political choices. I only have time to give you one example. I'm going to focus on a little discussed set of international legal agreements that I call labour migration agreements. I talk more about these agreements in Melbourne Asia Review, where you can also find links to scholarship on which I'm building, including work, for example, by Robert Cover. India's labour migration agreements set out some rules about Indians moving to work abroad. Most have been entered since the establishment of the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs, which was responsible for these agreements until it was merged into the Ministry of External Affairs in 2016. In any event, this work on labour migration agreements continues. India now has labour migration agreements with at least 10 countries, including many of the countries to which Indians most often move, such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Malaysia. The labour migration agreements aren't expressed as being enforceable in a court, and they draw little attention. For many people, law is all about enforceability, but law is about so much more than that. Law helps shape us. It helps us understand the world and how we should act in it. To properly understand what law does, we need to pay attention to the stories that law tells. So what kind of story do India's labour migration agreements tell? Well, it's a story that aligns with conventional wisdom about migration and development. So it's first worth saying something about that conventional wisdom. Often described as the migration development nexus, it suggests that people generally move abroad from poor countries so that they can send money home in the form of remittances. And these remittances help poor countries develop by contributing towards their economic growth. That probably doesn't sound too surprising. After all, it has become the conventional wisdom. One problem, though, immediately presents itself. Migrants don't always send money home. So the conventional wisdom suggests adopting policies to try to make sure this happens. One way to do this, it is said, is for migrants to move temporarily rather than permanently, which helps maintain migrants' connections to their homeland. Now, this distinction between temporary migration and permanent migration is less solid than people tend to assume. Some people who move temporarily or as temporary migrants stay permanently. Some permanent migrants wind up returning to their place of origin. But classifying a person as a temporary migrant still matters. In particular, it affects a person's legal status in a way that makes them more vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous employers. Even so, in line with the conventional wisdom, each of India's labour migration agreements deals only with temporary migration. Permanent migration isn't prohibited, but the agreements give Indians one pathway to move abroad, and it's a temporary pathway. That is, the agreements tell a story of temporary migration. It's a story that helps normalise and encourage temporary migration. It helps shape a world in which Indians move abroad to work and are categorised as temporary migrants when they do. Of course, this world of temporary migration isn't anything new, nor is it being created by labour migration agreements on their own. But we're already used to thinking about how national immigration laws in destination states limit migration. We're much less aware of the ways in which states like India are shaping temporary migration by signing international agreements. Yet this world of temporary migration also suits states like India. Development has been a fundamental concern of the Indian state since Indian independence. It was central to the high-level committee report, central to the work of the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs, and today it's central to that ministry's successor within the Ministry of External Affairs. And what does development mean? Well, it might mean many things, but it's often come to be treated as synonymous for economic growth, which remittances might help promote. There are also many ways to see the connection between migration and development. The conventional wisdom now says that temporary migration is good for development, and that's an idea that's built in to India's labour migration agreements. Those agreements reflect a choice that involves encouraging Indians to work abroad so that they might send money home and help produce economic growth in India. There's nothing inherently evil in this choice, but it is a choice. A political trade-off is being made. Migrant exploitation is commonplace. Of course, it's not inevitable that any individual migrant will be exploited, but it's absolutely clear that many temporary migrants will be. This is widely recognised, and yet Indians are being encouraged to move abroad temporarily anyway. With its vast diaspora, India is now the world's leading recipient of remittances. According to the conventional wisdom, these flows of people out of India and money into it help India develop. Yet these flows haven't happened by chance, and nor do they come without a cost. Today, I'm drawing attention to this cost, to a political choice that's being made, but not being widely discussed. A choice that's helping put some Indians into vulnerable positions abroad. Thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for starting us off on India. And I think there's a lot we can unpack there and bring up in the discussion as well. And for everyone who's watching on Zoom, I've just put a link in the chat to Robbie's article in the Melbourne Asia Review, so you can read a little bit more about these topics that we've just introduced. And now moving on to our second case study, we'll look at China with Yan Tan. Thank you, Yan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Scarlett, for inviting me to talk about the China case study. You know, the Chinese diaspora population is one of the world's largest at more than 60 million. Nearly 70% of them live in Southeast Asian countries, mainly Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The rest of them are primarily distributed in Europe, North America, and Australia. Diaspora engagement policy has undergone many shifts since the Great Opening Up of 1978, but is now converging on a multifaceted and intrinsically transnational system of engagement in the service of soft power. I want to highlight 4 key characteristics of China's diaspora engagement policy and practice that emerged from our recent interview narratives. The first characteristic is the rise of recruiting highly skilled talents. Talent engagement in China largely focuses on top talent programs, notably the Thousand Talents Plan, TTP, established in 2008, aimed at recruiting leading international scientists, research professionals, and technological innovators. About 90% of TTP recipients are reported to be overseas Chinese. However, attracting top talents becomes quite sensitive now. Respondents attributed this sensitivity to China's relations with the Western countries, particularly the intensifying trade war with the US. China's strategy for engaging diaspora talent has engendered serious friction with the US, which accuses China of enticing distinguished researchers in high-tech fields such as artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, genetic engineering, and quantum computing into illegal transfers of technology that breach intellectual property rights. Since 2018, China's talent plan has retreated to a lower profile to reduce its sensitivity. In current circumstances, attracting talent is clearly no longer a bring-in strategy confined to domestic development imperatives. Rather, it is an essential component of and one of the triggers for competition and attempts at repositioning by global powers in the high-tech era. The second characteristic is the move to emphasizing diaspora as promoting soft power. Since President Xi Jinping's accession in 2012, stressing public diplomacy is shaping the country's soft power and disseminating Chinese culture and social values worldwide has become a high priority. China is actively reaching out to the international community to facilitate the exchange of technology, wisdom, and experience, establishing a community with a shared future for all mankind, promote the integration of overseas Chinese into the destination societies, and enable them to tell good Chinese stories. Our stakeholders believe that integration at destinations can benefit both the countries of origin and destination. In-depth surveys reveal China's strong intention to promote this integration. For example, a leader from the All China Federation of Returned Overseas Chinese, Qiao Lian in Chinese language, mentioned that, I quote, the Chinese government should build platforms for diaspora members to integrate quickly in their destination, achieving self-development and contributing to the local society. This is a win-win situation because successful integration into the destination enhances the capacity to reward their motherland. I finished quoting. Current policies aim for public diplomats telling stories in the diaspora. Two variants emerge in the telling stories theme. Individuals telling small stories and media promoting more general stories about China. The third characteristic is reconsidering citizenship and residency. In the 1980s, when China started to develop its economy, a major constraint was the lack of capital investment. Engagement policy sought to tap financial resources in the diaspora, especially in such countries like Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and internally in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Economic reform and development require stable international relations, so the Chinese government refrained from direct political claims on diasporas, assuring destination countries that it was not pursuing an expansionist agenda. In 1980, the nationality law of China was enforced, closing the option of dual nationality entirely. Dual citizenship now appears to be an important topic in diaspora engagement for the Chinese government to consider. Overseas Chinese academia and generally overseas Chinese communities have a strong voice as to the issue of dual citizenship, because it can indeed attract overseas talents. But China has no immediate intention to offer its diaspora such rights. The fourth and last characteristic is institutional reform. There are major changes in the structure of national agencies for Chinese diaspora management resulting from the institutional reforms of 2018. 5 institutions known as the Wuqiao in Chinese language have played a central role in steering operations with the overseas Chinese at the national level since 1978. In March 2018, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, CPC, issued a decision on deepening reform of a party and state institutions, requiring a profound modernization of the system of socialism with the Chinese characteristics and a reviewed capacity of state governance. Wuqiao institutions have accordingly undergone restructuring. International forces related to the escalation of China-US trade tension and a rising awareness of anti-foreign interference in many countries, including Australia, combined with the internal forces such as institutional conflicts, have brought China's reform of diaspora institutions to the table. After the reform, China now has two major systems in managing overseas Chinese affairs: the United Front Work Department, 统战部 in Chinese language, which is under the leadership of the CPC, and Chaolian. Chaolian is not a governmental agency, and its nature is complex, so it is more apt for engagement across national borders. The operation of China's diaspora engagement policy has tended away from the macro or national level toward the meso or community level to engage diasporas more effectively through organizations rather than government agencies. In conclusion, to engage with diasporas effectively, China is deploying all-dimensional and multi-scalar use of linkages, expanding from economic to social-cultural spheres. China's policy not only shapes its internal development, but also influences global sentiment and brings new dynamics to bear global on power relations, most saliently with the United States perhaps, especially through talent attraction and soft power. And these findings combine to suggest that China's diaspora engagement policy, practice, and outcomes reach powerful effects outside its borders. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing with you later.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yan, for talking to us about China. And once again, we have an article to share in the chat with you. So please do go ahead and read more of Yan's words in the Northern Asia Review. And it will be very interesting to compare China's approach to the other two states when we move to the discussion. For now, let's move on to Andrew Rosser, who will be speaking to us about our third case study, Indonesia.
Thanks, Scarlett. Look, although this will be a short presentation, I'll progress in three stages. I'll first provide a bit of a sketch of the Indonesian diaspora as it currently stands. Secondly, I'll talk about the nature of the Indonesian government's approach to diaspora engagement. And then thirdly, if time permits, I'll talk briefly about some of the obstacles that have emerged in terms of that approach to diaspora engagement. Look, estimates vary of the size of the current size of the Indonesian diaspora. An organization called the Indonesian Diaspora Network, which is arguably the most prominent diaspora organization representing Indonesians overseas at present, has put the size of the Indonesian diaspora at 8 million people. In 2017, the World Bank published a report on Indonesia's global workers and stated in that report that in its estimate, Indonesia had something in the vicinity of 9 million global workers. According to the UN migrant stock data, that places Indonesia, I think, somewhere around 11th or 12th in terms of the size of its diaspora, well behind countries like India and China with very large, Mexico and Russia as well with very large diasporas. But still, it's a country with a fairly significant diaspora. The country's diaspora is located overwhelmingly in Asia and the Middle East, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, particularly Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bangladesh, Singapore, and Hong Kong. There are also reasonably sizable diasporic communities in Indonesian diasporic communities in OECD countries, particularly the Netherlands, the US, and Australia. I find it useful. People often talk about the Indonesian diaspora as if it's a kind of coherent, singular sort of unit, but in fact, it's internally quite divided. I find it useful to think in terms of the diaspora as having four main elements: migrant workers, particularly sort of low-wage migrant workers who work in roles like domestic helper or plantation worker or construction worker. That element is far and away the largest element in the Indonesian diaspora in terms of numbers. Although it's not a particularly prominent element in discussions about state diaspora relations in Indonesia. Those conversations tend to focus more on other components of the Indonesian diaspora. Those other components include professionals and students, and a small number of political and business elites. Also, marriage migrants are a kind of discrete and identifiable component within the Indonesian diaspora as well. Despite the fact that Indonesia has a reasonably sizable diaspora, and that diaspora is now organised in the form of organisations like the Indonesian Diaspora Network. Indonesia's approach to diaspora engagement is probably best characterised as one of limited engagement and limited responsiveness to the concerns of the diaspora. One of the key concerns on the part of the Indonesian Diaspora Network and more generally the diaspora has been the question of dual citizenship. Indonesia doesn't currently allow dual citizenship except in limited circumstances. And the Indonesian Diaspora Network has called publicly for many years now for Indonesia to change its laws on that front, but to no avail. The state has so far failed to pass legislation that would make that possible. The Indonesian Diaspora Network has also called for better representation of the Indonesian diaspora in the Indonesian National Parliament. Specifically, they've called on the government to establish a special electorate for the diaspora. Again, the government has not responded positively to those concerns. The government has set in place a few initiatives related to the diaspora, but they haven't been overly effective. There was an initiative by the Ministry of Manpower, if I remember correctly, to set aside certain jobs in the Indonesian civil service for members of the diaspora, but the relevant scheme attracted very, very few applications. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has introduced a diaspora card that is meant to sort of be modelled to some extent on the overseas Indian card issued by the Indian government to members of its diaspora, and in that case, the card provides some genuine entitlements and rights. The big complaint from the Indonesian diaspora groups is that the Indonesian version of that card really is quite useless, and there's been consequently relatively little take up of the cards. The government has signalled an intention to introduce diaspora bonds. Diaspora bonds are a sort of special financing instrument targeted at diaspora communities, and with the intention of trying to attract new investment into the homeland community, and I would expect that Indonesia will go ahead at some point and introduce these bonds, but it hasn't done that so far. Within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is a diaspora desk that's been established. Indonesia hasn't gone as far as some other countries in setting up dedicated ministries and the like for expatriate affairs or diaspora affairs. It's established a small desk within the Foreign Affairs Ministry instead. There are regular congresses held, diaspora congresses, in which some state officials will participate, but those congresses are driven much more by the Indonesian Diaspora Network and the people that support that organisation, rather than by the state itself. There has been some progress in terms of protection of migrant workers' rights. There was an important law passed in 2017 on the protection of migrant worker rights that migrant worker activists were very happy with, but we're still yet to really see whether the new law produces any real change in practice. Look, just on obstacles, I'll just make a couple of very quick points by way of wrapping up. I think in contrast, certainly to the other countries that we're looking at in this seminar, China and India, Indonesia is something of a laggard, I guess, in terms of developing initiatives, really significant initiatives to engage with its diaspora. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, one is the strength of economic nationalism within Indonesian politics. Any claims by the diaspora for new rights, such as rights of dual citizenship, right to a special electorate in Indonesian national elections, and so on, run up against a very strong and politically powerful nationalist sentiment, and as well as, of course, running up against concerns about possible threats to Indonesian national security. A second, I think, key obstacle to more significant engagement between the Indonesian state and its diaspora has been the fact that the diaspora itself is quite internally divided. I mean, there aren't just the four distinct groups that I mentioned before, and a real difference, I guess, in terms of the sorts of elements that are dominant within the Indonesian Diaspora Network, the main diaspora organisation, and the main component of the Indonesian diaspora, namely migrant workers. So the divide within the diaspora isn't just related to that particular divide. There's also a divide within the leadership of the Indonesian Diaspora Network, and in fact, the Indonesian Diaspora Network split in 2017 into two separate organisations. So even amongst the more sort of elite elements within the Indonesian Diaspora Network, there are divisions that have undermined its ability to present a united face of the diaspora on key issues. Look, I'll leave it at that, Scarlett.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, again, a lot of important issues you picked up on there. And now you didn't write on Indonesia for Melbourne Asia Review, but you did have a wonderful article in there as well. So I'll also just share that in the chat for everyone before we move into our discussion. And Andrew, and actually Jan as well, brought up this issue of dual citizenship and the fact that each of our case studies actually do not allow that. So I'm wondering if we could just spend a moment here getting into this particular issue and looking at why is it the case, and what are the obstacles. I think it's an assumption we might make that citizens would want to have the option for dual citizenship. So what's in the way of that happening? I'll pass over to you first, Robbie, to comment on that, but also invite anyone to start sending in questions as well if you have them.
Thanks, Scarlett. So interestingly, so India does, as Andrew said, India does have a scheme for overseas citizenship of India, but that doesn't give people voting rights. It doesn't make them Indian citizens. It's quite misleading in a way to call them citizens. They do get treated as an Indian in some respects. They get they don't need visas to visit India. They pay the same prices as Indian citizens for some things like national parks or airline tickets, things like that. But it's not dual citizenship. Now, interestingly, in 2001, when the High-Level Committee on the Indian Diaspora sets out its report that's been so influential, they talked about dual citizenship, and they talked about dual citizenship in the context only of basically rich countries, more or less, not exactly, but more or less. And they thought that was a good idea. It's obviously not been taken up. And the concern, and I suspect the concern just generally is national security, some version of the notion that people could come in surreptitiously and claim to be Indian. And of course, India there are many people in Pakistan or Bangladesh who might be able to somehow or another claim some form of Indian citizenship if it was available. And so perhaps that's part of the issue. I think that's all that I can sensibly say.
Thanks, Robi. And Yan, could you tell us a bit more about the approach to dual citizenship in China's case as well? I don't expect we'll see a change there anytime soon.
Yeah, sure. China is implementing a single citizenship regime, which was constructed during the Cold War era, soon after the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Dual citizenship was offered to everyone who can claim Chinese origins, but implementation stalled in 1955 after the Sino-Indonesian Dual Nationality Treaty, with a purpose to halt China's diplomatic isolation in the Southeast Asian region, which then hosted through 3/4 of all overseas Chinese or diasporas. In 1980, China's new nationality law closed entirely the option of dual nationality. Since 1999, a proposal on granting dual citizenship or quasi-citizenship have constantly been submitted to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, but all such proposals have been declined, confirming that China has no immediate intention to offer its diaspora such a right. But the good thing is that since 2010, Chinese law and institutions have begun to respond this situation. For example, in 2013, a new exit entry administration law introduced a talent visa to attract highly skilled workers, lowering the threshold for a green card and reducing administrative impediments in entry, exit, and residency. Interestingly, Chinese emigrating after 1978, also termed as new migrants in the Chinese context, make more strident demands for dual citizenship. They want to, for example, purchase housing in China and travel to China conveniently. New Chinese migrants in Australia, New Zealand, and North America particularly strongly demand dual citizenship. But officially, dual citizenship will not be become available at least in the foreseeable near future. But let's see how it evolves. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Yan. And Andrew, if there's anything further you'd like to say, I know you already talked a bit about dual citizenship, but if there's any comment you'd like to give us here as well.
Yeah, well, look, I can provide a bit more detail and try and get into the politics a little bit more, as which I think is what your question was aimed at trying to elicit from us. So look, the current situation in Indonesia is that under the 2006 citizenship law, Indonesians are not allowed to hold dual citizenships, except in the case of children born to mixed couples. They are able to hold two citizenships until the age of 18, at which point they have to choose. So that's the current situation. When the Indonesian Diaspora Network was formed in 2012, or in the wake of a congress, the first Indonesian Diaspora Congress, which was held in 2012. Dual citizenship very quickly became the core focus of that particular organisation, and so there has been subsequently a bit of campaigning, a bit of lobbying, and much public discussion about the issue of dual citizenship, and the IDN has prosecuted its case for the introduction of dual citizenship. But the whole issue has really gone nowhere politically. Initially, President Joko Widodo indicated some support for the introduction of dual citizenship, but he was never able to follow through on the promises he made to try and introduce it. And the issue has run up against a number of different types of opposition. I mean, on the one hand, there's been a view that members of the Indonesian diaspora are fairly privileged. I mean, here the diaspora is being understood as groups like professionals, those members of the elite that I mentioned before, and even marriage migrants rather than the migrant workers. But anyway, there's been a view that the diaspora is relatively elite and relatively privileged, and it doesn't need any additional help from the Indonesian government. There's also been a concern, as I said before, that the introduction of dual citizenship would pose a security threat to the Indonesian government, to the Indonesian nation. I mean, the reasons for that are never sort of well spelled out, and they seem to be based more on paranoia than anything else, and a desire to maintain control. They emanate in particular out of the military and the security and the intelligence agencies, and aligned elements. And I also think there's an element of racism in the, it's very rarely stated explicitly. Occasionally it is, but very rarely stated explicitly. But I think there is a sort of an undertone of racism in some of the opposition to dual citizenship, and that emanates from two things. I mean, one is, as Yan has sort of already intimated, there is a long history of issues to do with citizenship in Indonesia, and a lot of them have centered on Indonesia's ethnic Chinese community. So the whole issue of citizenship is in a way associated with the ethnic Chinese, and they've been sort of discriminated against historically in a variety of different ways. But the other sort of factor here is that some of the most prominent figures within the Indonesian diaspora network and the Indonesian diasporic community more generally are of ethnic Chinese background, and so I think that produces a kind of a knee-jerk nationalist reaction underpinned by racism in some cases.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and we've actually just had another question on this topic through the chat, just while we're here, is in the wake of COVID-19, would dual citizenship be looked at as a necessity rather than an option? Do you think anything's changed in terms of, just in terms of the necessity of where we are now with COVID-19? And anyone can jump in.
So this is just a short comment.
Yeah.
I haven't yet looked into this question in a serious way, but I do think this is a very good question, which deserves serious research.
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, maybe a bit more work for you to do in researching that, and perhaps we'll have more to say later on this topic. Did either of you want to jump in before we move on?
Look, I'll say something very briefly, and unless Robi wants to talk first.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, look, you know, the question is dual citizenship a necessity rather than an option in the wake of COVID-19? I mean, look, you know, one of the main arguments made in favour of dual citizenship is that it facilitates labour mobility. It just makes it easier for people to move around the world, to take up work opportunities. In the case of Indonesia, it's been, I guess, the professionals and the elites and also the marriage migrant elements within the Indonesian diaspora that have been the strongest proponents of dual citizenship. Migrant worker groups have been much less concerned about the issue, I think, in part because, you know, a lot of them are undocumented and you know, have a very questionable citizenship status as a result. So it's been more of a concern for particular parts of the diaspora, for whom the ability to move across international borders is really, really important for a variety of different reasons. But I guess the thing about COVID-19 is that it's produced a you know, a real brake on international movements of people, and even, you know, in a place like Australia, for instance, where dual citizenship is allowed, it hasn't been any easier for people to move across borders. As you know, we all know, I mean, a whole lot of Australians have been stuck overseas because the Australian government has closed its borders. So, you know, I don't know whether COVID-19 somehow or other increases or strengthens the case for dual citizenship. Probably the resumption of you know, increased labour mobility on the other side of COVID-19, I think would probably do more to help build a case for dual citizenship in those places that don't already have it.
I think the one thing that I might add, if I can, from India's perspective, is that so many of the Indian workers who are abroad are in the Persian Gulf region, and they're not foreign citizens. It's very, very difficult to become a citizen of one of the Persian Gulf countries. So so the Indian diaspora gets divided into two groups: non-resident Indians who are Indian citizens and who include most of these people in the Persian Gulf, and persons of Indian origin who have taken out the citizenship. India did help, to some extent at least, workers in the Persian Gulf. But interestingly, this year, remittances have gone up in India. So in World Bank data that was released, I think just last week, India's remittance data is up again. So maybe in Australia we have a slightly different perspective on COVID, but it doesn't seem to have stopped as much movement as we in Australia might think it has, at least for Indians moving to certain places.
Thanks, Robi. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a different perspective I think we have here in Australia, perhaps to the rest of the world. Now, there are some other things I'd love for us to move on to, but there's a question that's come in still on dual citizenship for you, Andrew, which is, To what extent do you think the presence after 1965 of Indonesian political exile groups within the diaspora might be causing the Indonesian government to be lukewarm towards this concept of the diaspora, but particularly to citizenship?
Yeah, look, thanks for that question, Scarlett. I see that it's come from David. Hi, David. David's written quite extensively on Indonesian political exiles, and in particular, Indonesians who were forced into exile after the New Order came to power in 1965-66. Look, my sense would be, and I can understand why David's asking this question, because a lot of the people who were forced into to exile were leftists, and they just didn't feel that it was safe to head home, and a good number of them were located in places like China and the Soviet Union, and of course this was the height of the Cold War, so they were very much on the wrong side of the political divide once the New Order took power. I mean, my you know, there may be you know, some connection here with the concern expressed by elements within the military and the security and intelligence agencies and so on about dual citizenship threatening the security, the national security of Indonesia. But my guess would be that these things happened so long ago that they're probably not foremost in the minds of the officials who are opposing dual citizenship on security grounds. I mean, my sense would be that you know, their concerns would be more likely to be related to threats of, say, related to Islamic terrorism, and just in general more contemporary sorts of concerns. I think there's also an economic dimension to this sort of security argument. I think there's a sense that if, you know, Indonesians who have other citizenships are able to have sort of free reign in Indonesia, free access to all sorts of things in Indonesia, that could produce some sort of, you know, outflow of funds and property and what have you from Indonesia that would benefit quote unquote foreigners over Indonesians. So that's my best guess anyway at an answer to David's question.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for the context as well for that question coming in. Robi, we have a question that's from an anonymous attendee, but definitely directed at you, and that's: how much is the Indian diaspora involved in Indian domestic politics, as it seems that many domestic issues are of a concern to them?
So I think the first thing to say is that, unlike some diasporas in some parts of the world, Indians can't vote. So the direct influence in terms of being a voting constituency isn't there in the way that it might be in some parts of the world. But that doesn't mean that the diaspora doesn't have some sway. I mean, non-resident Indians can vote, but I think we're talking mostly about people who've been out of India for a while, classified as persons of Indian origin, many in the US. So Modi has gone to the US and held some huge rallies there, raises money there. The whole notion of India's engagement with the diaspora is partly to get money from the diaspora, help with India's development, as well to take in knowledge and build connections with the diaspora in a way that might be seen to be benefiting the Indian economy. So there's definitely influence there, but it's not quite that thing, and it's not quite that thing where the diaspora is a voting bloc. I don't think that would be an accurate characterization of what the diaspora does. But yes, there's lots of engagement and potentially lots of influence. There are annual congresses held in India, sometimes held outside India as well. So definitely there's influence there, and I think that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Robbie. We're running a little bit short on time, but I'd love if we could just before we end approach a couple of other important topics. And one is the issue of migrant workers and protection for migrant workers, if there is any. So knowing that there's no dual citizenship and that we have these diasporas away from their home nation states, is there any protections? I'll throw to you first, Jan, to help migrant workers while they're away from home. Oh, and we'll just ask you to unmute. There we go.
Okay, so in the Chinese context, China has implemented the regulation on the administration of a foreign labor cooperation since 2012. This regulation serves to standardize foreign labor cooperation, protect the legal rights and interests of contract workers in particular, and promote the healthy development of foreign labor cooperation. Second thing, the Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Public Security, and the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and State Administration for Industry, Commerce, and Transport, and so on, have established the coordinating system to manage entry and exit overseas labor disputes or emergencies, and the safety of foreign and overseas labor is mainly handled by the Department of Chinese Foreign Affairs. And China has established the Department of Consular Affairs, Chinese Consular Protection Center, since 2004, in charge of consular protection and assistance, drafting protection policies and regulations, and publishing consular protection assistance, early warning information, and so on. And final thing, I just wish to quickly point out, in 2012, the State Council announced stricter rules requiring that all labor agencies be registered and demanding that they purchase work injury insurance, ensure workers have valid visas, pay wages, comply with the labor standards in the destination country, and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. And I think we only have time for one more thing. I'd just like to ask Andrew, what does all of this mean for Australian development moving forward?
Oh, as in, say, Australia's approach to international development through the aid program or other mechanisms that it might use. Look, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have a particularly brilliant answer to the question. I mean, my sense is that aid policymakers in Australia don't really have issues to do with state diaspora relations and their influence on the migration development nexus keenly on their radar screens. I mean, there's certainly been some thinking in the Australian government about the migration development nexus. That thinking tends to centre on the utility of temporary migration programs, particularly focused on Pacific Island states, as a way of helping to promote development in the relevant countries, the South Pacific countries, in particular, through the channeling of remittances from Australia back to home nations. So, at the global level, certainly in organisations like the World Bank and the UNESCO, there's a very active discussion around what's often referred to as the diaspora option, which is a term that corresponds or refers to a set of policies, the sort of policies we've been discussing today, that states might adopt as a way of engaging with their diasporas to promote development in the homeland. So certainly at the international level, these things are being thought through, but I don't know that the Australian government's been a particularly active participant in those sorts of discussions. So look, as a starting point, if there's an implication for the Australian Development Program, maybe it's to cast an eye at these sorts of issues and debates and think them through and see if there's an opportunity for Australia to provide some sort of assistance. Australia itself, of course, is not exactly a model that of diaspora engagement that it might be able to draw on to provide assistance to other countries. Its own approach to diaspora engagement is lacking in a variety of different ways. It's not one of the more active states. But nevertheless, there might be something Australia can contribute.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you to all of our speakers tonight. I feel like we could keep going on this topic for quite some time, and it's probably worth us having another event to just continue the topic. But for now, we've reached our limit. So I'd like to thank each of you for offering your time and your expertise this evening, and also to everyone who joined us live via Zoom webinar or Facebook. And the event has been recorded, so if you missed it, you'll get a link to the recording, and I'll send that out soon. It will also be available on the Melbourne Asia Review website, which I've put in the chat. But if you're watching this on the replay, or you don't feel like looking at the chat, you can just type Melbourne Asia Review into Google and you'll find it very quickly. So that's all for now. We hope to see you next time, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.